we have talked about, I touched on waste before, but basically this is a picture from a study by the Ministry for the Environment back in 1997. And it does paint a pretty shocking picture, really, of the proportion of demolition and construction waste that was going to landfill at that time. At that time, and probably 4 or 5 years before that, we were engaged with research to get a handle on what was happening with plasterboard. You know, what were the causes of waste? How could we reduce it, or how could we use the waste that was being generated on the building sites, both commercial and in residential sites? Because we have a fairly sparse population density, really, when it comes down to it. So, you know, whilst Auckland is reasonably medium-high density, most of the country, of course, and we've got probably half of the business associated with building materials around the Auckland region, we still have other areas which are very sparsely populated, and it becomes more difficult to get a handle on what's happening with waste. But there's been numerous studies over the year to get a handle on what proportion of waste going to landfill from construction and demolition was plasterboard. And in doing that sort of work, we've also collaborated to understand other waste streams as well coming from building sites. And also what could be done to reduce them in the first instance. One of the more interesting aspects of some of that research has been to induce some understanding of waste and waste management from a design process as well. So we've sponsored programs like this one here at Victoria University School of Architecture, looking at closing the loops on materials in the built environment. A little bit whimsical, you could say, but what we're trying to do there is to induce in students' minds, your student colleagues' minds, some understanding of what they can do to reduce waste from a design process, and I'll touch on that a little bit further. So we continue to sponsor that particular category. In regard to the total reduction, recycle and reuse process, from a reduction perspective, I suppose that one of the key elements that have been introduced in the 90s was horizontal fixing. For those of you who've got a bit of grey hair, and I haven't got a lot, but some of you have, you may recall in the 70s and 80s that common practice was really to do vertical fixing. The great change, and it may not seem to be great, was to induce change to horizontal fixing and the use of longer sheets. You know, from a design perspective, I think that you've picked that up pretty well. There's still room for improvement, but just as an illustration, you know, having been involved with managing very, very large interior contracting businesses, we used to always provide for waste and plasterboard at above 15%, in some cases 20%. You know, that's a huge amount of waste. But that's just the way things were done, you know, in the 70s and 80s. In the residential market now, with the correct design, appropriate design, and with appropriate installation practices on site, that can be down to 5%. So we're talking at least a 10% reduction in plasterboard usage, I have to say, and waste generation on residential building sites, if it's managed well. But it does need to be managed both from a design and an installation perspective. But that's quite significant when you think about it. You know, when in terms of tonnage, that could be in the region of 15 to 20,000 tonnes reduction in waste going to landfill in New Zealand. A lot of material. At the other end of the as I call it, the ambulance at the end of the cliff, or the bottom of the cliff, is the recycling of the waste that is generated. And as you can see here, this is just one of many programs that we've been directly involved with, or directed ourselves, or worked with local councils all around the country, and with construction companies such as Mainzeal, Fletcher's, Hawkins, you name it, as well as group housing companies, is to understand the extent of and what can be done to reuse the materials. And I touched on before that we've found really the best use of the waste material is in fact in horticulture and agriculture, and particularly as a component in compost. So around the Auckland area, for instance, we have quite extensive arrangements. Well, not we, but we've collaborated with and facilitated collection services through the likes of Pink Bins, Environfert and Dalton's. Dalton's are a major compost operation down in Matamata if you're ever driving down that way. So they collect and take the waste and incorporate it very usefully as cellulose and calcium sulphate component in compost. And that seems to be the way that's it's being usefully used around the country. Down country, we were talking to people in Nelson, and the local council are doing the similar sort of thing. They're collaborating in terms of residential waste collection, separation and collection and reuse and compost. And we've heard that the Wellington City Council are doing similarly. They've got a green waste collection process down there and with an associated relationship with a composting company. As far as our manufacturing operations are concerned, it's not viable for us to reprocess the material for reuse in the volumes that are being generated. But what we do is that we have very, very high efficiencies in our production, world-class production efficiencies. So we don't generate a lot of waste internally, but what waste is generated internally is predominantly used, it's ground and reused back into the board. So there's not a lot. In fact, none of it goes to landfill at all now. Most of it goes back into our board, with a very, very small proportion going to Dalton's for compost. Just very, very quickly, one of the elements in Green Star, and I'd like to think in this talk, I'm not quite sure whether it is there, is indoor air quality. So this is just to bring to your attention our efforts, and I know that our colleagues at Resene and other similar manufacturers have worked on this for some years, is the introduction of VOC-free. Essentially VOC-free, I mean, they're at levels where they're almost immeasurable, to be perfectly honest, the adequacy of the test methods are such. So as you can see here, we encourage you as designers to specify them specifically. And rather than high VOC materials, I have to say that we still retain some, but we certainly would encourage you to specify these sorts of materials. As you can see, the GIB-Fix one is our major GIB-Fix adhesive, and has a very, very low VOC. And when you have a look at environmental choice requirements around this, the classification there to qualify for environmental choice certification is less than 50 grams per litre. As you can see there, we're way, way down the scale, virtually zero. We don't claim it's zero because of the vagaries of the test method. But again, from a indoor air quality, I think it's something that your homeowner clients particularly will benefit from. In terms of other aspects of what we do, as I said, we've got environmental choice for most of our plasterboards, and recently we've got it listed, plasterboards listed on EnviroSpec. So those of you who are engaged with commercial Green Star tools, can I just ask who's involved with the commercial Green Star tool at all? So there's a number of you. So look, bear with me whilst I go through this, because I think it's useful for those involved with the residential market just to touch on some aspects of the Green Star commercial tool, which was introduced a couple of years ago. And it's become pretty well entrenched, as Nick has said. But there's some interesting elements and similarities if you look at the elements here, which all cascade up to or down to a single star rating. Including the materials and waste. So, and that's where our focus has been.